They say age is just a number, but apparently my son Marcus didn't get that memo. When he looked me straight in the eye and told me I was too old for the family ski trip to Aspen, something inside me shifted. What he didn't know was that while he was planning his little exclusive getaway, I had been sitting on a secret that would change everything. You see, sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up getting the biggest shock of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Thelma Howard, and for 68 years, I've been collecting stories, memories, and apparently, a lot more than my family ever realized. I raised Marcus as a single mother after his father decided that fatherhood wasn't quite the adventure he'd signed up for. I worked double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, came home to help with homework, packed lunches, attended every soccer game and school play. I thought I'd built something beautiful with my son, a relationship rooted in respect and love. I thought wrong. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in March. I was in my kitchen, the same modest kitchen I'd been cooking in for 30 years, preparing Marcus's favorite meal. He'd called earlier asking if he could come over to talk about something important. I'd spent the afternoon making his grandmother's famous pot roast, the recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations of Howard women. The house smelled like rosemary and red wine, comfort and tradition mixing in the warm air. Marcus walked in with his wife Jennifer, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog for expensive outdoor gear. Jennifer's blonde hair was pulled back in one of those effortless ponytails that probably took 20 minutes to perfect, and Marcus had that confident stride that comes from a man who's never had to question whether he belongs somewhere. They sat down at my small dining table, the one I'd bought secondhand when Marcus was 10, and had refinished myself, sanding away years of scratches and memories. The conversation started casually enough. Marcus talked about work, his promotion at the consulting firm, how well things were going. Jennifer chimed in about her yoga instructor certification and the wellness retreat she was planning to host in the fall. They seemed happy, successful, everything I'd hoped for my son. Then Marcus cleared his throat and exchanged a look with Jennifer, one of those married couple glances that said they'd rehearsed this moment. "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about the family vacation this year," Marcus began, cutting into his pot roast with precise movements. "We've decided to do something a little different." I set down my fork, sensing something in his tone that made my chest tighten. "Oh, what did you have in mind?" Jennifer jumped in, her voice bright with artificial enthusiasm. "We're planning this amazing ski trip to Aspen. Marcus's college friends are going. And it's going to be so much fun. Really active, you know? Lots of skiing, snowboarding, hiking in the snow." I waited for the invitation, for them to tell me about the cozy cabin they'd found with an extra room, about how they'd love for me to come along even if I didn't ski. Instead, Marcus reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for children and pets. "The thing is, Mom," he said slowly, "we think this trip might be a little too intense for someone your age. I mean, you're 68, and it's going to be pretty physical. We don't want you to feel left out or uncomfortable." The words hit me like cold water. Too intense for someone my age. I stared at my son, this man I'd raised to be thoughtful and inclusive, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, not shatter, just crack, like the first line in a dam that's been holding back years of pressure. "I see," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. "And what exactly makes you think I can't handle a ski trip?" Jennifer laughed, a tinkling sound that felt like broken glass. "Oh, Thelma, it's not that we don't think you're capable. It's just that this is going to be a really young crowd, and we want to be able to really let loose, you know? Stay up late, party, be spontaneous. We thought maybe you'd prefer something more age-appropriate. Age-appropriate." The phrase echoed in my head as I looked around my small dining room at the life I'd built within these modest walls. I thought about all the times I'd included Marcus and Jennifer in everything, all the holidays I'd hosted, the birthdays I'd planned, the support I'd given without question. I thought about the hiking trips I'd taken just the year before, the marathon I'd completed at 65, the energy I still felt coursing through my body every morning when I woke up. Marcus must have seen something in my expression, because he leaned forward, his voice taking on that tone people use when they're trying to smooth over something uncomfortable. Look, Mom, it's not personal. We just think you'd be happier doing something more relaxing. Maybe a nice cruise, or one of those bus tours to see fall foliage. A bus tour? My own son was suggesting I shuffle off on a bus tour like some stereotype of elderly helplessness. I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I kept my voice calm, measured. This was a moment that would define everything that came after, and I wasn't going to waste it on an emotional outburst. I understand, I said, standing up to clear the plates. You want to party with your friends without worrying about your old mother cramping your style. That's not, Marcus started, but I held up my hand. It's fine, Marcus. Really. I hope you have a wonderful time in Aspen. They left shortly after that, Jennifer air-kissing my cheek and promising to send pictures from the trip. Marcus hugged me goodbye, and I could feel his relief that I hadn't made a scene, hadn't demanded an explanation or begged to be included. He thought I was being gracious, understanding. He had no idea that I was being strategic. After they left, I sat in my living room, still furnished with the same modest pieces I'd collected over the years, and stared at the wall where Marcus's graduation photos hung. Medical school, business school, wedding pictures, all the milestones I'd been there to support and celebrate. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the dreams I'd deferred, the life I'd built around being his mother first, and Thelma Howard second. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my single bed in my small bedroom, listening to the house settle around me, and something fundamental shifted in my understanding of who I was and what I deserved. For 42 years, I defined myself by my relationship to Marcus. I was Marcus's mother, the woman who'd given up her own ambitions to ensure his success, who'd lived quietly and modestly so he could have everything he needed. But lying there in the dark, I realized something that both terrified and thrilled me. I wasn't just Marcus's mother. I was Thelma Howard, and Thelma Howard had secrets. The next morning, I made a phone call I hadn't made in over a year. The number was still in my address book, written in my careful handwriting next to a name that most people wouldn't recognize. Margaret Ashworth, attorney at law. Margaret had been handling certain affairs for me for nearly 2 decades, quietly, discreetly, exactly as I'd requested. Thelma? Margaret's warm voice came through the phone. How lovely to hear from you. How are you feeling about everything? I'm ready, Margaret, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I think it's time. There was a pause, and I could almost hear Margaret smiling. Are you sure? Once you start down this path, there's no going back to the way things were. I looked around my small kitchen, at the life I'd carefully constructed to appear modest, unremarkable, exactly what everyone expected from a retired nurse living on a pension. But appearances, as I was about to prove, could be very deceiving. I'm sure, I said. Set everything in.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Motion. What Marcus didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that his grandfather, my late father, hadn't just been a simple factory worker, as I'd always told them. Winston Howard had been what people politely called eccentric, and what others less charitably called paranoid. He'd spent his entire life convinced that the government was coming for his money, that banks couldn't be trusted, and that the only safe investment was land. While other men his age bought new cars and took vacations, Winston had quietly purchased property. Lots of property. Acres and acres in what were then considered undesirable locations, places too remote or too wild for most people to want. He'd paid cash for everything, often buying directly from desperate sellers who needed quick money and didn't want to deal with banks or lawyers. Winston had died when Marcus was 12, and I'd been the sole heir to what everyone assumed was a modest estate. A small house, some savings, maybe enough to help with Marcus's college expenses. What they didn't know was that Winston's worthless land had become incredibly valuable over the past 26 years. That remote acreage in the Colorado mountains that Winston bought for practically nothing in the 1970s? It was now sitting in the heart of one of the most exclusive resort areas in the state. The useless forest land in Vermont that he'd picked up for back taxes? It was now prime real estate with million-dollar views. Property after property that Winston had acquired with his suspicious mind and cash-only transactions had appreciated beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But the crown jewel of Winston's paranoid real estate empire was a piece of land he'd bought in 1968, a sprawling estate in the mountains of North Carolina that came with a half-built mansion. The previous owner had run out of money during construction, and Winston had bought the whole thing for a fraction of what it should have cost. Over the years, he'd quietly finished the construction, using his savings and his obsessive attention to detail to create something magnificent. When Winston died, I'd inherited it all. Every acre, every building, every secret asset he'd accumulated. Margaret had helped me understand the scope of what I'd inherited, and together we'd made a decision that seemed wise at the time. We'd keep it quiet. Marcus was just starting high school, full of dreams about college and his future. I was working as a nurse, living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet. The smart thing would have been to sell some of the property, use the money to make our lives easier. But I'd watched what sudden wealth did to families, how it changed relationships and created expectations. I wanted Marcus to earn his success, to build character through struggle, to become the kind of man who valued hard work and integrity. So Margaret and I had created a trust, a complex legal structure that kept all of Winston's assets separate from my everyday life. The properties were maintained by management companies, the profits quietly reinvested, the whole empire growing steadily while I continued to live like a modest retired nurse. I'd told myself it was temporary, that someday I'd tell Marcus the truth, that the money would be there for emergencies or for my retirement. But as the years passed, it became easier to maintain the fiction. Marcus grew up believing we had very little, that every opportunity he got was something he'd earned through his own merit. He worked hard in school, earned scholarships, built a successful career without ever knowing he had a safety net waiting in the wings. I had been proud of the man he'd become, convinced that my decision to hide our wealth had been the right one. Now, sitting in my kitchen with Margaret's number dialed and the phone ringing, I realized that my decision had worked too well. Marcus had grown up to be successful, but he'd also grown up to see me as someone small, limited, defined by my modest circumstances. He saw the nurse's salary and the secondhand furniture, and assumed that was all there was to me. He'd never looked deeper, never wondered if there might be more to his mother than met the eye. The irony was perfect. Marcus thought I was too old and too poor for his ski vacation. He had no idea that I owned a mansion in the mountains that would make his Aspen resort look like a budget motel. After my call with Margaret, I spent the rest of the morning doing something I hadn't done in years. I went up to my small bedroom closet and pushed aside the modest clothes I wore every day, reaching into the very back where a small safe was hidden behind a false wall Winston had installed decades ago. Inside were papers, photographs, and keys that represented a life Marcus had never imagined I was capable of living. I pulled out a thick folder labeled Blue Ridge Estate and spread the contents across my bed. Architectural plans for a 12,000-square-foot mansion. Photographs of soaring great rooms with stone fireplaces tall enough to stand in. Images of master suites larger than my entire current house, of wine cellars and home theaters and indoor pools that seemed to stretch on forever. This was my inheritance, my secret, my ace in the hole that I'd been saving for someday. Well, someday had arrived, and it was wearing designer ski gear and telling me I was too old for adventure. I picked up one particular photograph, a panoramic shot of the mansion's main terrace overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. The view was spectacular. Rolling peaks stretching to the horizon, morning mist rising from valleys that looked like they'd been painted by angels. The terrace itself was a masterpiece of stone and wood, large enough to host a wedding or a corporate retreat, furnished with custom outdoor furniture that had cost more than most people made in a year. This was where I was going to spend my vacation while Marcus and Jennifer played in the snow in Aspen. This was where I was going to remember who Thelma Howard really was. underneath all the years of modest living and quiet sacrifice. I called Margaret back with specific instructions. The mansion was to be fully prepared for my arrival. The staff that maintained the property year-round was to ensure everything was perfect. The wine cellar was to be stocked with the finest vintages. The master suite was to be prepared with fresh flowers and the Egyptian cotton sheets that had been waiting in storage for years. And Margaret? I added, feeling a smile spread across my face for the first time in days. I want you to arrange for a photographer. Professional quality, someone who knows how to capture luxury lifestyle content. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then chuckled. Thelma Howard, you are about to have the time of your life. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I didn't tell Marcus about my change of plans. When he called to check on me, making sure I wasn't too hurt about being excluded from the Aspen trip, I simply told him I'd decided to take a little vacation of my own. That's great, Mom, he said, relief obvious in his voice. Where are you thinking? Maybe that bus tour we talked about? Something like that, I replied, not bothering to correct his assumption. Just a quiet little getaway in the mountains. Perfect. You deserve some rest and relaxation. We'll bring you back something nice from Aspen. A souvenir. My son was planning to bring me a souvenir from the vacation I was too old to attend. I almost laughed out loud at the beautiful irony of it all. The day before my departure, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I went shopping for myself. Really shopping. Not the careful budget-conscious trips to discount stores that had defined my retail therapy for years. I drove to the upscale shopping district across town and walked into stores I'd only ever passed by, stores where price tags didn't have to be checked before considering a purchase. I bought clothes that fit the woman I was about to become again. Cashmere sweaters in colors that made my eyes shine, leather boots that were works of art as much as footwear, a coat that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment and made me feel like royalty when I slipped it on. For the first time in decades, I bought things not because they were practical or sensible, but because they were beautiful and because I deserved beautiful things. The saleswoman at the boutique, a stylish woman about Jennifer's age, was attentive and respectful in a way that surprised me. She didn't see an elderly woman on a fixed income trying to stretch a dollar. She saw a customer with excellent taste and, apparently, the means to indulge it. You have wonderful style, she told me, as I tried on a silk scarf that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. These colors are perfect with your complexion. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, really looked, and saw something I'd forgotten existed. Not Marcus's mother, not the modest retired nurse, but Thelma Howard. A woman with intelligence in her eyes and strength in her posture. A woman who'd survived everything life had thrown at her and come out not just intact, but victorious. That night, I packed my new clothes in a suitcase I'd owned for years but never had reason to use, a beautiful leather set that Winston had bought me for a honeymoon we'd never taken. I folded the cashmere and silk with the same care I'd once used to pack Marcus's school clothes, but this time the attention was for myself, for the woman I was about to rediscover. I left early the next morning, before the sun was fully up, driving my modest sedan out of my modest neighborhood toward a destiny that Marcus could never have imagined. The drive to North Carolina took most of the day, winding through mountains that grew more spectacular with each mile. As I drove, I felt layers of expectation and limitation falling away like old skin. For years, I'd been living down to other people's expectations, staying small so others could feel comfortable, hiding my light so no one would be blinded by it. I'd convinced myself it was noble, this quiet sacrifice, this deliberate diminishment of my own possibilities. But somewhere on that mountain road, with my expensive new clothes in the back seat and my destination growing closer with each mile, I realized it hadn't been noble at all. It had been cowardly. I'd been afraid of what would happen if people knew who I really was, what I was really capable of. I'd been afraid that my success would threaten others, that my wealth would change how people saw me. So I'd hidden it all, buried it so deep that I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't real. But it was real. The mansion waiting for me in the mountains was real. The woman who'd earned and inherited and carefully preserved this life was real. And it was time to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The estate gates appeared around a curve in the mountain road just as the sun was beginning to set, casting everything in golden light that made the scene look like something from a fairy tale. Wrought iron gates 12 feet tall swung open automatically as my car approached, recognizing the electronic signal Margaret had programmed years ago. The driveway stretched ahead of me, winding through perfectly manicured grounds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. And then, around the final curve, the mansion came into view. 12,000 square feet of stone and timber, rising from the mountainside like something that had grown there naturally, but had been shaped by master craftsmen into perfect beauty. The photographs in my folder hadn't done it justice. The setting sun lit the stone facade with warm light, making the massive windows glow like jewels. The main entrance was framed by columns that soared 3 stories high, supporting a balcony that overlooked the circular drive where a fountain danced in the evening light. This was mine. All of it. The woman Marcus thought was too old for a ski vacation owned this palace in the mountains, and he had no idea it existed. I parked in the circular drive and sat for a moment, just taking it all in. Then I got out of my modest sedan, straightened my new cashmere coat, and walked up the stone steps to my front door like the queen returning to her castle. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal the great room that had lived in my imagination for so many years. Vaulted. Ceilings stretched 40 feet overhead, supported by timber beams that had been hewn from trees older than the country itself. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, already crackling with a fire that the caretaking staff had prepared for my arrival. Furniture arranged in perfect conversation groupings, each piece chosen for beauty as much as comfort, created intimate spaces within the vast room. And the view. Through floor-to-ceiling windows that made up the entire far wall, the Blue Ridge Mountains stretched to the horizon, layer upon layer of peaks painted in shades of purple and gold by the setting sun. It was a view that belonged in a museum, except it was mine to enjoy whenever I chose. I walked through the mansion slowly, reacquainting myself with rooms I'd only visited a handful of times over the years. The formal dining room with its table for 20 and crystal chandelier that cast rainbow prisms across the walls, the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and rolling ladder, comfortable chairs positioned to take advantage of both the fireplace and the mountain views. The wine cellar that Winston had carved into the mountainside itself, temperature-controlled and stocked with vintages that had been aging since before Marcus was born. The master suite took up the entire top floor of the east wing, a sprawling space that included a sitting room, a bedroom with a bed large enough for a small family, and a bathroom that looked like it belonged in a luxury spa. The bathtub was carved from a single piece of marble, positioned perfectly to take advantage of the mountain views through windows that could be shuttered for privacy or left open to make you feel like you were bathing in the sky itself. Fresh flowers were arranged throughout the suite, exactly as I'd requested. White orchids and pale pink roses, elegant and understated but unmistakably expensive. Egyptian cotton sheets in cream and gold were turned down on the massive bed, and someone had thoughtfully left a bottle of champagne chilling in an ice bucket beside a plate of chocolate-covered strawberries. I opened the champagne and poured myself a glass, then walked out onto the private balcony that adjoined the master suite. The view from here was even more spectacular than from the great room, if that was possible. I was high enough to see over the trees to valleys and peaks that stretched all the way to the horizon, a landscape so beautiful it took my breath away. Standing there on my private balcony, sipping champagne that cost more than Marcus probably spent on groceries in a month, I thought about my son and his wife skiing in Aspen, completely unaware that their too-old mother was living better than they'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow, the photographer would arrive, and I would begin creating a record of my vacation that would make their Instagram posts from Aspen look like budget travel snapshots. But tonight, I was simply going to enjoy being Thelma Howard, not Marcus's mother or the modest retired nurse or any of the other small roles I'd played for so many years. Tonight, I was going to remember what it felt like to be magnificent. The next morning, I woke up in Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like sleeping on clouds. Sunlight streaming through windows that framed the mountains like living paintings. For a moment, I forgot where I was, my mind expecting the small bedroom and narrow windows of my modest house. Then I remembered, and the smile that spread across my face felt like sunshine itself. I'd slept better than I had in years, not just because of the luxury surrounding me, but but because for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I belonged. No one to cook breakfast for, no one's schedule to accommodate, no one's needs to put before my own. Just Thelma Howard in her mountain palace, with an entire day stretched ahead of her like an unopened gift. The mansion's staff had left fresh coffee in the kitchen, along with a selection of pastries from a bakery in Asheville that probably cost more per croissant than I used to spend on an entire week's worth of bread. I carried my breakfast out to the main terrace, settling into a chair that faced the mountain vista, and called Margaret. "How did your first night go?" she asked, warmth evident in her voice. "Like coming home," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "Margaret, I think I've been living the wrong life." She laughed softly. "No, Thelma. You've been living someone else's idea of your life. There's a difference." We discussed the photographer's arrival time and the plans for documenting my stay. But more than that, we talked about the future. About what this week might mean for how I chose to live going forward. "You know," Margaret said carefully, "you don't have to go back to that small house. You don't have to pretend to be poor anymore. This mansion, this life, it's yours. It's always been yours." The thought sent a thrill through me that was part terror, part exhilaration. She was right, of course. Nothing was forcing me to return to my carefully constructed, modest existence. I could sell the small house, move here permanently, live like the wealthy woman I actually was. The idea was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. After breakfast, I decided to explore the grounds properly. I'd seen photographs over the years, reports from the groundskeeping staff, but I'd never taken the time to really experience the estate as it was meant to be experienced. I slipped on my new leather boots and one of my cashmere sweaters, feeling like I was dressing for the part one was finally ready to play. The gardens were spectacular, designed by the same landscape architect who'd worked on several famous botanical gardens. Terraced stone walls created different levels and environments, from formal rose gardens near the house to wild meadow areas that seemed to blend seamlessly into the natural mountain landscape. Paths wound through groves of ancient trees, past hidden benches positioned to take advantage of particularly stunning views. I found myself at a gazebo I'd forgotten existed, a delicate structure of wrought iron and climbing vines positioned at the highest point of the garden. From here, I could see the mansion below me, majestic against the mountain backdrop, and I could hardly believe it was mine. For so many years, I'd lived like someone grateful for scraps, careful not to ask for too much, not to take up too much space. Standing in my own gazebo, looking down at my own mansion, I felt the full weight of how much of myself I'd hidden away. The photographer arrived just after lunch, a professional woman named Caroline who specialized in luxury lifestyle photography. She was younger than Jennifer, but carried herself with a confidence that came from genuine accomplishment rather than manufactured image. When she saw the mansion and grounds, her eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that comes from knowing you're about to create something exceptional. "Mrs. Howard," she said, adjusting her camera equipment, "this is absolutely breathtaking. I've photographed some incredible properties, but this is something special." We spent the afternoon creating images that told the story I wanted to tell. Not the story of a modest retired nurse grateful for simple pleasures, but the story of a woman who owned magnificence and wore it well. Caroline photographed me in the great room, the massive stone fireplace providing a dramatic backdrop, my new clothes and confident posture making me look like someone who belonged in such surroundings. We moved to the library, where she captured me reading beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, natural light streaming in to illuminate both the leather-bound books and my face. The formal dining room provided another stunning backdrop, the crystal chandelier catching the light as I sat at the head of the long table, looking like someone accustomed to hosting important dinners. But my favorite shots were taken on the main terrace at sunset. Caroline positioned me with the mountain vista stretching behind me, the golden light of evening making everything look magical. I held a glass of wine from my own cellar, wearing my most beautiful new outfit, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was seeing the real Thelma Howard through someone else's eyes. "You're a natural at this," Caroline said as she reviewed the images on her camera. "You look like you've been living this life forever." "In a way I have," I said, thinking about all the years I'd carried this possibility inside me, hidden but never forgotten. That evening, I did something I'd been looking forward to all day. I opened my laptop and began uploading the photographs to social media accounts I'd barely used for years. My Facebook profile still showed the modest version of my life. Pictures from church dinners and small family gatherings. Images that spoke of quiet contentment, rather than luxury or adventure. But tonight, I was going to change that narrative completely. The first photograph I posted was of the mansion's exterior at sunset. The massive stone structure glowing with warm light against the mountain backdrop. I kept the caption simple. Sometimes a change of scenery is exactly what the soul needs. Then came the interior shots. The great room with its soaring ceilings and massive fireplace. The library with its floor-to-ceiling books and leather furniture. The formal dining room that looked like it could host royalty. Each image more spectacular than the last. Each one a piece of evidence that Thelma Howard was not who anyone thought she was. I posted photos of the terrace with its mountain views, of the wine cellar with its carefully curated collection, of the master suite with its marble bathroom and four-poster bed. I shared images of myself in my new clothes, looking confident and elegant, clearly at home in surroundings that spoke of wealth and taste. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments began appearing within minutes, each one more shocked than the last. Friends from church, former colleagues from the hospital, neighbors from my modest subdivision, all expressing amazement at images they could hardly believe were real. "Thelma, where in the world are you staying?" wrote Helen from my book club, followed by a string of shocked face emojis. "This place looks like something from a magazine," commented Sarah, a former coworker. "Did you win the lottery?" But it was the lack of response from Marcus and Jennifer that interested me most. I knew they'd see the posts. Their social media habits were as predictable as clockwork. Yet, as the evening wore on and my notifications continued to explode with amazed comments from everyone else, they remained conspicuously silent. I poured myself another glass of wine and settled into one of the leather chairs in the library, scrolling through the growing collection of responses to my posts. People were sharing my photos, tagging friends, expressing disbelief that quiet Thelma Howard could be living such a luxurious life. Some were asking direct questions about how I could afford such a place. Others were simply expressing admiration for the beauty of the estate. Around 10 o'clock, my phone finally rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, my voice calm and pleasant. "Hello, Marcus." "Mom." His voice was tight, confused. "I just saw your Facebook posts. Where exactly are you?" "I told you I was taking a vacation in the mountains," I said, settling back in my chair and enjoying the view of my own library. "Didn't I mention it was going to be quite lovely?" "You mentioned a quiet getaway. You didn't mention a mansion that looks like it belongs in Architectural Digest." I could hear Jennifer in the background, her voice sharp with questions I couldn't quite make out. Marcus shushed her, but I could sense the tension crackling between them. "It is quite beautiful, isn't it?" I said, taking a sip of my wine. "The views are spectacular, and the accommodations are more than adequate." "Mom, this place looks like it costs thousands per night. How are you paying for this?" The question I'd been waiting for, delivered with exactly the tone I'd expected. Not concern for my happiness or curiosity about my adventure, but immediate worry about money, about how their modest mother could possibly afford such luxury. "Oh, you don't need to worry about the expense," I said, keeping my voice light. "I have it well in hand." "But Mom, this doesn't make sense. You live on a nurse's pension. You shop at discount stores. You drive a 15-year-old car. How do you suddenly have money for a place like this?" I smiled at the view of my mountain estate, at the life I'd kept hidden for so long, finally revealed in all its glory. "You'd be surprised what a person can accomplish when they put their mind to it, Marcus." "This is crazy. You need to tell me what's going on. Are you in some kind of trouble? Did someone talk you into spending your retirement savings on some ridiculous luxury vacation?" The concern in his voice might have been touching, if it hadn't been so clearly about the money. He wasn't worried that I was having a breakdown or making poor decisions for my own sake. He was worried that I was spending money that might someday be his inheritance. "I'm not in any trouble," I said firmly. "In fact, I'm having the most wonderful time I've had in years. The staff here is exceptional, the food is exquisite, and the wine cellar is remarkably well stocked." "Staff? Mom, what kind of place is this?" "The kind of place where a person can remember what it feels like to be treated with the respect they deserve," I said, letting just a hint of edge creep into my voice. There was a long pause, and I could hear muffled conversation as Marcus covered the phone to talk to Jennifer. When he came back on the line, his voice had taken on the careful tone people use when they think they're dealing with someone unstable. "Mom, I think maybe you should come home. We can talk about this, figure out what's going on. This isn't like you." "You're absolutely right," I said, standing up and walking to one of the library windows, looking out at my moonlit gardens. "This isn't like the me you know. But perhaps the me you know isn't all there is to know." I could practically hear him struggling with how to respond to that. Finally, he tried a different approach. "Look, we're worried about you. This is just very sudden, very out of character. The mom I know doesn't post pictures of herself drinking wine in mansions. The mom you know also doesn't get invited on family vacations because she's too old," I said quietly, letting the words hang in the air between us. Another long pause. "Mom, that's not what we meant." "Isn't it?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, in this lovely library in this magnificent house, it seems like you made some assumptions about what your old mother was capable of. And those assumptions were incorrect." I could hear Jennifer in the background again, her voice more insistent now, though I still couldn't make out the words. Marcus was clearly under pressure from multiple directions. "We just want to make sure you're okay," he said finally. "This is all very confusing." "I'm more than okay," I said, walking over to pour myself another glass of wine. "I'm spectacular. The weather has been beautiful, the accommodations are first-rate, and I'm rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. But how are you paying for this?" "Back to the money." Always back to the money with Marcus, just like it had always been back to what I could provide, what I could give, what I could sacrifice for his benefit. "That's not really your concern, is it?" I said, my voice still pleasant but with steel underneath. "I'm a grown woman, Marcus. I'm perfectly capable of making my own financial decisions." "Of course, but—" "No buts," I interrupted gently. "I'm having a wonderful vacation. I'm perfectly safe and happy, and I'll be in touch when I'm ready." "Enjoy, Aspen." I hung up before he could respond, then turned off the phone and set it aside. For the first time in our relationship, I had ended a conversation with my son on my terms, at my pace, without feeling obligated to soothe his concerns or manage his emotions. The silence that followed felt golden, like the wine I was drinking, like the moonlight streaming through my library windows. I had just claimed something I'd never possessed before, the right to live my own life without explanation or apology. The next morning brought a flurry of texts from Marcus, each one more agitated than the last. He'd obviously spent the night trying to figure out how his modest mother could afford a luxury vacation, and his messages showed increasing frustration with his inability to solve the puzzle. "Mom, please call me back. We need to talk about this. I've been looking at luxury resorts in NC, and they're all incredibly expensive. I don't understand how you're affording this. Jennifer thinks maybe you're staying with friends and just making it look like a fancy resort. Is that it? Please just call me. This whole thing is making me crazy." I read through them while enjoying breakfast on the terrace, another perfect morning in my mountain paradise. The desperation in his messages was almost amusing. For his entire adult life, Marcus had been able to categorize and understand his mother completely. I was predictable, manageable, safely contained within the boundaries he'd established for me. Now those boundaries had exploded, and he was struggling to rebuild his understanding of who I was. The cognitive dissonance of seeing his poor mother living in luxury was clearly eating at him, and part of me was enjoying his discomfort more than I probably should have. I decided to post another round of photographs, these ones showing the more intimate details of my luxurious morning. The perfectly prepared breakfast tray with its fine china and crystal juice glass, the view from my private balcony, with mountains stretching to the horizon. A close-up of my hand holding a coffee cup worth more than most people's dinner, my manicured nails and elegant rings catching the morning light. The response was even more dramatic than the night before. My phone began buzzing with calls and messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, all wanting to know where I was and how they could afford similar luxury. My modest social media presence had suddenly become the subject of intense curiosity and speculation, but it was a message from my neighbor Dorothy that made me pause. Dorothy had lived next to my small house for over a decade, and we'd had countless conversations over the fence about budgets and sales and the struggles of living on fixed incomes. "Thelma," she wrote, "I don't know what's going on, but I'm so happy to see you living like this. You deserve every bit of beauty and luxury in those pictures. You've spent so many years taking care of everyone else. It's about time someone took care of you." The message brought tears to my eyes, not because it was particularly eloquent, but because Dorothy had seen something others were missing. She wasn't questioning how I could afford this or whether it was appropriate for someone my age. She was simply celebrating the fact that I was finally claiming something beautiful for myself. I spent the morning exploring parts of the estate I'd never visited, discovering hidden gardens and secluded sitting areas that Winston had created decades ago. Each new space was more beautiful than the last, and I found myself wondering how many other secrets this place held, how many corners of luxury I had yet to discover. In the afternoon, I did something I'd never done in my entire life. I called the estate's concierge service and arranged for a spa day. Within 2 hours, a team of professionals had arrived at the mansion, turning one of the guest suites into a temporary spa where I received a massage, facial, and manicure that probably cost more than I used to spend on personal care in an entire year. As the masseuse worked on tension I didn't even know I'd been carrying, I thought about all the years I'd denied myself such simple pleasures. Not because I couldn't afford them, but because I'd convinced myself they were frivolous, unnecessary, somehow inappropriate for a woman of my circumstances. But what circumstances? I was a wealthy woman who'd chosen to live modestly, and there was nothing wrong with modesty as a choice. The problem came when modesty became a prison, when it prevented me from experiencing joy and beauty and the full range of what life had to offer. That evening, I dressed for dinner as if I were entertaining important guests, though I was dining alone. I wore one of my most elegant new outfits and had the staff prepare a meal in the formal dining room, complete with candles and flowers and multiple courses paired with wines from my own cellar. Sitting at the head of that long table, looking out at the mountain views through floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt like I was finally inhabiting my own life instead of living around the edges of it. This was what it felt like to claim space, to take up room in the world without apology. My phone rang during dessert, and I was surprised to see it was Jennifer calling, not Marcus. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello, Jennifer?" "Thelma." Her voice was different than usual, less bright, more calculating. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, taking a sip of dessert wine. "I can't imagine what we'd have to discuss. This whole situation is getting out of hand. Marcus is beside himself trying to figure out what's going on with you, and honestly, some of your social media posts are concerning." "Concerning how?" "Well, it's just not like you to be so ostentatious. Posting pictures of expensive wine and luxury accommodations, people are starting to ask questions." Ostentatious. The word hung between us like an accusation. In Jennifer's world, apparently, it was ostentatious for a woman my age to enjoy luxury, to share images of beauty, to claim space in the digital world where she and Marcus posted their own carefully curated lifestyle content without a second thought. "What kinds of questions?" I asked, genuinely curious. "About where you got the money, about whether this is some kind of scam or if you're making poor financial decisions. Helen from your book club called Marcus, asking if you'd inherited money and not told anyone. People are confused." The truth was becoming clear. This wasn't really about concern for my well-being. This was about image management, about controlling the narrative around their family. Jennifer was worried that my sudden display of wealth was making them look bad somehow, or perhaps making people question why they'd excluded me from their own luxury vacation. "I see," I said calmly, "and what would you like me to do about people's confusion? Maybe tone it down a little? I mean, if this is some kind of special vacation you've saved up for, that's great, but posting about it constantly is just... it's not very classy." Not very classy. From the woman who posted daily selfies from yoga classes and shared every detail of her wellness coaching business with her followers. Apparently, social media was only appropriate for certain kinds of people sharing certain kinds of content. "Jennifer," I said, setting down my wine glass and looking out at my mountain views, "I'm curious about something. When you and Marcus post pictures from your trips, your dinners, your lifestyle, is that ostentatious? That's different. How? We're young, we work hard, we've earned the right to enjoy ourselves." And I haven't? The silence on the other end of the line was telling. In Jennifer's mind, apparently, I hadn't earned the right to luxury, to enjoyment, to sharing my experiences with others. I was supposed to stay quietly in my small house, living modestly, being grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. "It's just unexpected," she said finally. "You've never shown any interest in this kind of lifestyle before. Perhaps you never bothered to ask what I might be interested in." Another pause, and I could sense her frustration growing. This conversation wasn't going the way she'd planned, wasn't allowing her to regain control of a situation that clearly made her uncomfortable. "Look, Thelma, we just think it would be better if you kept this vacation more private. Maybe stopped posting so much about it. People are starting to talk. Let them talk," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I'm having the most wonderful time I've had in years, and I'm not going to hide that to make other people more comfortable. But what will people think?" "They'll think that Thelma Howard is living her best life," I said, standing up and walking to the dining room windows. "And they'll be absolutely right." I hung up before she could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. Whatever Jennifer and Marcus were dealing with back home, whatever damage control they felt they needed to do, was not my problem. I was done managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own joy. That night, I posted one more photograph before bed. It was a simple image of my hand holding a glass of wine, the mountain vista visible through the windows behind me, my elegant rings catching the light. The caption read, "Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is remember that she deserves beautiful things." The response was immediate and overwhelming, but this time it was different. Mixed in with the shock and curiosity were messages of support and admiration from women who understood exactly what I meant. Comments from friends and strangers alike, celebrating my courage to claim luxury, to take up space, to live boldly. "You go, girl," wrote someone I didn't even know. "It's never too late to live your dreams." "This is so inspiring," commented a former coworker. "You look absolutely radiant." "Goals," posted a young woman whose profile showed she was Jennifer's age. "I hope I'm living this well when I'm older." For every comment questioning how I could afford such luxury, there were two more celebrating the fact that I was enjoying it. The narrative was shifting, and people were beginning to see what I'd finally seen myself, that there was nothing wrong with a woman claiming beauty and luxury and joy for herself, regardless of her age or other people's expectations. I fell asleep that night in my Egyptian cotton sheets, surrounded by the kind of luxury I'd denied myself for decades, feeling more authentically myself than I had in years. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new opportunities to rediscover the woman I'd been hiding beneath layers of modest expectations and careful self-limitation. But tonight, I was simply Thelma Howard, wealthy woman, mansion owner, mountain queen, finally home in the life I'd always deserved to live. The morning of my 4th day at the estate brought an unexpected visitor. I was enjoying breakfast on the terrace when I heard the sound of tires on gravel in the circular drive. From my elevated position, I could see a sleek black BMW pulling up to the main entrance, and my heart gave a small skip when I recognized the rental car sticker on the windshield. Marcus stepped out of the driver's seat, looking disheveled and agitated even from a distance. He'd clearly driven through the night from Aspen, abandoning his ski vacation to confront whatever crisis he thought I'd created. Behind him, Jennifer emerged from the passenger side, her usual composure replaced by something that looked like barely controlled panic. I set down my coffee cup and watched as they stood in my circular drive, staring up at the mansion with expressions of pure disbelief. Even from the terrace, I could see Marcus running his hands through his hair, the way he'd done as a child when confronted with something beyond his understanding. Jennifer was turning in slow circles, taking in the scope of the estate, her mouth slightly open as she tried to process what she was seeing. The staff had been alerted to the possibility of unexpected visitors, and I watched as Charles, the estate manager, approached them with the kind of polished professionalism that came from years of dealing with the wealthy and entitled. I couldn't hear the conversation from my position on the terrace, but I could see the gestures, the way Marcus pointed toward the house while Charles remained calm and composed. After a few minutes, Charles looked up toward the terrace where I was sitting and gave me a subtle nod. I lifted my coffee cup slightly, a signal we'd arranged the day before. If I wanted to see visitors, I would wave them up. If I preferred to remain undisturbed, I would simply continue with my breakfast. I took my time deciding, savoring the moment of having complete control over whether and how this confrontation would happen. For the first time in my relationship with Marcus, I held all the cards. He was on my territory, subject to my rules, dependent on my willingness to see him. Finally, I waved Charles toward the house, and he escorted my son and daughter-in-law up the stone steps to the main entrance. I remained on the terrace, finishing my breakfast at my own pace, letting them wait in the great room while I prepared myself for what would undoubtedly be the most important conversation of our relationship. When I finally entered the great room 15 minutes later, I found them standing in the center of the vast space, looking like they'd been dropped into an alien world. Marcus was staring up at the 40-foot ceilings, while Jennifer had moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the mountain views with an expression that mixed awe with something that might have been envy. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, settling into one of the leather chairs arranged around the massive stone fireplace. "What a surprise to see you here." Marcus turned toward me, his face a mixture of confusion, concern, and something that looked suspiciously like accusation. "Mom, what is this place?" "It's my home," I said simply, gesturing for them to sit in the chairs across from me. "Well, one of my homes, anyway." Jennifer's head snapped toward me at that comment, her eyes widening. "One of your homes?" "Oh yes," I said, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. "This is the mountain house. There's also the property in Vermont, some lovely acreage in Colorado, a few other pieces here and there. Winston was quite the real estate investor, it turns out." Marcus sank into one of the chairs as if his legs had given out. "Winston? My grandfather. But he was a factory worker." "Among other things," I said, pouring myself fresh coffee from the service that Charles had discreetly arranged on a side table. "He was also paranoid about banks, and convinced that land was the only safe investment. Turns out he was more right than anyone realized." "You've been rich this whole time?" Jennifer's voice came out as almost a whisper, but there was an edge to it that suggested she was processing more than just the financial implications. "Not rich," I corrected gently, "wealthy. There's a difference. Rich is about money. Wealthy is about assets, about choices, about having the freedom to live as you choose, rather than as circumstances dictate." Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees in the same gesture he'd used as a child, when he was trying to understand something that seemed impossibly complex. "But you lived in that small house. You drove an old car. You shopped at discount stores. You worked as a nurse until you retired." "Yes, I did all those things," I agreed. "Because I chose to. Because I wanted you to grow up understanding the value of work, the importance of earning your way in the world. Because I believed that character was built through struggle, not through inheritance." "So you lied to me," Marcus said, his voice flat with the kind of hurt that comes from having your entire understanding of reality challenged. My whole life you've been lying to me. I considered his words carefully, understanding that this was the crux of everything that would follow. How I responded to this accusation would determine whether we could rebuild our relationship or whether this moment would mark its end. "No, Marcus," I said finally. "I didn't lie to you. I simply didn't tell you everything. There's a difference between deception and privacy." "Privacy?" Jennifer stood up abruptly, pacing toward the windows before turning back to face me. "You call this privacy? You own a mansion that looks like something from a movie. And you never mentioned it?" "I call it good parenting," I said firmly. "I wanted you to become the kind of man who succeeded on his own merit, not because he was waiting for an inheritance. And you did. You built a successful career, you've accomplished things you can be proud of. Would that have happened if you'd known about all this?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer but still filled with confusion. "I don't understand why you're telling me now. Why reveal it like this, with social media posts and this whole dramatic production?" "Because you told me I was too old for your vacation," I said simply. "Because you and Jennifer decided that I didn't belong in your life of adventure and luxury, not realizing that I was perfectly capable of creating my own." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of recognition. Marcus's face flushed as he remembered that conversation, as he began to understand how his words had landed with someone who had options he'd never imagined. Jennifer, however, seemed to be processing the situation from a different angle entirely. "So when we were struggling after college, when we moved in with you because we couldn't afford rent, you could have just bought us a house?" "I could have," I agreed. "But that wouldn't have helped you become the people you needed to become. Struggle teaches lessons that comfort never can." "But we lived in that tiny house with you for 2 years, Jennifer continued, her voice rising. "I gave up my apartment, my independence, because Marcus said we needed to save money. And you were sitting on millions the whole time? I was teaching my son about responsibility and the value of hard work," I said, my voice remaining calm despite the growing tension in the room. "And it worked. Look at what you've both accomplished." Marcus stood up and walked to the windows, staring out at the mountain views that stretched to the horizon. "This is insane," he said quietly. "My whole life has been built on a false foundation. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every time I worried about money or worked extra hours to pay bills, you could have just fixed it all." "And if I had," I said, rising from my chair to join him at the windows, "what kind of man would you have become? Someone who expected problems to be solved for him? Someone who never learned to push through difficulties or find his own strength? Maybe someone who felt loved," Marcus said, turning to face me with eyes that held a pain I hadn't expected. "Maybe someone who felt like his mother trusted him enough to be honest with him." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for the first time since this conversation began, I felt my confidence waver. I had been so focused on the lessons I thought I was teaching, so convinced that I was doing the right thing, that I hadn't considered how my secrecy might feel like rejection to the child I'd been trying to protect. "Marcus," I said softly, reaching out to touch his arm, "I did love you. I do love you. Everything I did was because I loved you." He pulled away from my touch, not angrily, but with the kind of hurt that goes deeper than anger. "No, Mom. Everything you did was because you thought you knew what was best for me. That's not the same thing as love. Love trusts. Love shares. Love doesn't build walls out of good intentions." Jennifer had been watching our exchange with an expression that was becoming increasingly calculating. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do you just continue pretending to be poor, or are you planning to suddenly start living like this all the time?" "I haven't decided," I said honestly, though even as I spoke the words, I realized they weren't entirely true. I had decided, in the deepest part of myself, where decisions are made before the conscious mind acknowledges them. I was never going back to that small house, to that limited life, to pretending to be less than I was. "Well, you need to decide," Jennifer said, her voice taking on the sharp edge I recognized from when she was trying to manage situations to her advantage. Because this affects all of us. People are asking questions about our family, about why Marcus's mother suddenly has access to luxury that we don't. It's embarrassing. Embarrassing for whom? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. For us, she said, as if it should be obvious. Marcus is supposed to be the successful one in the family. He's the one with the education, the career, the income. When his mother starts posting pictures of mansions and luxury, vacations, it makes him look like he's not successful enough to take care of his own family. The truth was finally emerging, and it wasn't really about my deception or even about feeling excluded from family wealth. It was about image, about the narrative Jennifer and Marcus had constructed around their own success, and how my sudden display of wealth threatened that story. Marcus, to his credit, looked uncomfortable with Jennifer's blunt assessment. "That's not what this is about," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I asked gently. "Because it seems to me that you're both more concerned about how this looks than about how I feel, or what I might need." "What you need," Jennifer's voice was getting sharper, "what you need is to stop making impulsive decisions that affect the whole family. This whole thing is obviously some kind of midlife crisis or something. You're almost 70 years old, Thelma. Acting out like this isn't cute." The condescension in her voice triggered something inside me that I'd been holding in check for too long. For years, I'd allowed Jennifer to speak to me with barely concealed disrespect, to treat me like an elderly relative who needed to be managed, rather than an autonomous adult deserving of courtesy. I'd told myself it was worth tolerating for Marcus's sake, that keeping peace in his marriage was more important than demanding respect for myself. But sitting in my own mansion, surrounded by the evidence of my own capability and success, I found I no longer had patience for being diminished by anyone, including my daughter-in-law. "Jennifer," I said, my voice quiet but carrying an authority I'd never used with her before. "You're a guest in my home. I suggest you remember that." She blinked at me, clearly surprised by the change in my tone. For a moment her careful composure slipped, and I could see the uncertainty underneath her aggressive facade. Marcus stepped between us, literally and figuratively. "Okay, let's all just take a breath here. This is a lot to process, and we're all saying things we might regret." "I'm not saying anything I regret," I said calmly. "I'm simply establishing some boundaries that perhaps should have been established years ago." "Boundaries?" Jennifer's composure was cracking now, her voice rising. "You want to talk about boundaries? How about the boundary of honesty between family members? How about the boundary of not making decisions that humiliate your son and his wife?" "The only thing that's humiliating," I said, standing up and moving toward the windows so I could look out at my gardens, my mountains, my view, "is your assumption that my life should be limited by your comfort level." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind through the trees outside. When I turned back to face them, both Marcus and Jennifer were staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not the fond tolerance they usually showed toward Marcus's harmless old mother, but something that looked almost like fear. "I think," I said carefully, "that we all need some time to process this conversation. Charles can show you to guest rooms if you'd like to stay the night, or he can direct you back to the main road if you prefer to find accommodations elsewhere." "We're not staying," Jennifer said quickly, grabbing her purse from where she'd set it on a side table. "This whole situation is crazy, and I'm not going to be part of whatever game you're playing." But Marcus hadn't moved from his position by the fireplace. He was staring at me with an expression that mixed hurt, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Mom," he said slowly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, of course. When you decided not to tell me about the money, about all of this," he gestured around the great room, "was it really just about teaching me responsibility, or was it also because you didn't trust me?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything, and I knew that my answer would determine whether we had any chance of rebuilding our relationship, or whether this moment would mark its permanent fracture. I walked back to where he was standing and looked directly into his eyes, the same dark brown eyes he'd had as a little boy, when his biggest worry was whether I would be there to pick him up from school. "Marcus," I said softly. I didn't tell you because I was afraid that if you knew I had money, you would see me differently. I was afraid you would start seeing me as a source of financial security, rather than as your mother. I was afraid that wealth would change our relationship in ways I couldn't control. So you didn't trust me, he said, not accusingly but with the sadness of someone confirming something he'd already suspected. I didn't trust the situation, I corrected. I didn't trust that money wouldn't come between us eventually. And maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe I should have had more faith in the man I raised. Jennifer was already at the great room entrance, clearly ready to leave, but Marcus remained where he was, processing what I'd said. The thing is, Mom, he said finally, by keeping this secret, you guaranteed that money would come between us. Because now I don't know what was real about my childhood, about our relationship, about anything. Everything was real, I said urgently. Every moment of love, every sacrifice I made, every time I chose your needs over my own wants, that was all real. The only thing that wasn't real was the story about our financial limitations. But that story shaped everything, Marcus said. Every decision I made, every goal I set, every worry I carried about being able to take care of you in your old age. All of that was based on a lie. Not a lie, I insisted. An incomplete truth. That's the same thing, Jennifer called from across the room. Marcus, we need to go. This is getting us nowhere. Marcus looked toward his wife, then back at me, and I could see the moment when he made his choice, not between Jennifer and me, but between processing this complex truth and walking away from it. I need time, he said quietly. I need to think about all of this, figure out what it means. Of course, I said, though my heart was breaking at the distance I could see growing in his eyes. Take all the time you need. He moved toward the entrance where Jennifer was waiting, then paused and turned back to me. Mom, I want you to know that I'm not angry about the money. I'm angry about the dishonesty. And I'm hurt that you didn't trust me enough to share this part of your life with me. I know, I said, fighting back tears that I refused to let fall until they were gone. And I'm sorry for that, truly sorry. After they left, I stood alone in my great room, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt hollow without someone to share it with. Charles appeared discreetly to ask if I needed anything, and I requested a bottle of wine from the cellar, something expensive and complex that would match my mood. I spent the rest of the day walking through the mansion and grounds, seeing them with new eyes now that the secret was out. Every room, every view, every carefully maintained detail felt different somehow, as if revealing the truth had changed the very nature of the place. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since arriving at the estate. I called Margaret not to discuss legal matters or practical arrangements, but because I needed to talk to someone who understood the weight of what had just happened. How did it go? She asked, her voice warm with concern. About as well as could be expected, I said, settling into a chair in the library with my wine. Which is to say, not well at all. I told her about the conversation, about Marcus's hurt and Jennifer's anger, about the way the truth had landed like a bomb in the middle of our family dynamics. Do you regret telling them? Margaret asked when I finished. I considered the question carefully, staring out at the mountain views that were becoming familiar and comforting in their constancy. No, I said finally. I regret the way I told them, the circumstances that forced the revelation. But I don't regret that they know. The secret was becoming heavier than the truth. And what now? Quote, now I decide who I want to be going forward, I said, taking a sip of wine that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. I can't go back to pretending to be poor. I can't stuff myself back into that small life. But I'm not sure I know how to be wealthy openly, especially if it means losing my relationship with Marcus. Thelma, Margaret said gently, you've been wealthy for 26 years. You already know how to be wealthy. What you're learning now is how to be wealthy without shame. Her words hit me like a revelation. She was right. I'd been managing wealth, making decisions about property and investments, living with the knowledge of my financial security for decades. What was new was the idea that I could enjoy it openly, share it publicly, claim it as part of my identity rather than hiding it like a guilty secret. The question, Margaret continued, is whether you want to be wealthy in isolation or wealthy in relationship. And if you want relationship, you're going to have to be patient, while the people you love adjust to this new understanding of who you are. After we hung up, I sat in the library until well past midnight, making plans, not just for the rest of my stay at the estate, but for the life I wanted to build going forward. A life that honored both the woman who had sacrificed for her son and the woman who deserved to claim her own joy. The next morning brought another surprise visitor, though this one was entirely welcome. Dorothy, my neighbor from my modest subdivision, arrived in a taxi that had clearly cost her a significant portion of her monthly budget. She climbed out looking determined and slightly overwhelmed, clutching a small overnight bag and wearing her best church dress. I met her at the front door, delighted to see her familiar face in this surreal landscape of luxury and family drama. "Dorothy," I said, embracing her warmly, "what in the world are you doing here?" "I came to check on you," she said simply. "After those pictures you posted, and then hearing through the neighborhood grapevine that Marcus drove off in the middle of the night looking like the world was ending, I figured you might need a friend." The simple kindness of it, the fact that someone had seen past the spectacle to the human being who might be hurting, brought tears to my eyes that I'd been holding back for 2 days. "Come in," I said, leading her into the great room where she stopped and stared exactly as Marcus and Jennifer had done, but where they had looked shocked and betrayed, Dorothy looked delighted. "Thelma Howard," she said, turning in a slow circle to take in the soaring ceilings and mountain views. "You magnificent woman. Look at this place." I spent the afternoon showing Dorothy around the estate, watching her genuine pleasure in every beautiful detail. She admired the gardens, marveled at the wine cellar, and sat in the library touching the leather bindings of books with the reverence of someone who understood their value. "How long have you owned this place?" she asked as we sat on the terrace watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "My father bought it in 1968, I said. "I inherited it when Marcus was 12. "And you never told anyone?" "I thought I was doing the right thing," I said, realizing how often I'd repeated those words in the past few days. "I thought secrets were the same as protection." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, sipping wine that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. "You know," she said finally, "I understand why you kept it quiet. Money changes things, and not always for the better. But Thelma, you can't live your whole life protecting other people from who you really are." "Marcus feels like I betrayed him." "Marcus feels like his understanding of reality got turned upside down," Dorothy corrected. "That's different than betrayal, even if it feels the same right now." We talked until late into the evening, and for the first time since Marcus and Jennifer's visit, I felt like I could breathe fully. Dorothy didn't judge my choices or demand explanations for my decisions. She simply accepted the revelation of my wealth as another layer of a person she'd already decided to care about. "You know what I think?" she said as we prepared for bed in guest suites that were larger than her entire house. "I think you're finally becoming yourself. And that's always a little scary for everyone involved, including the person doing the becoming." The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in days. Dorothy was right. I was becoming myself, not changing into someone new but finally allowing the person I'd always been to exist without apology or concealment. I spent the morning on the phone with Margaret, making arrangements that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. I was selling the small house, the one where I'd hidden my true circumstances for so many years. I was also making plans to spend significant time at the mountain estate, not as a vacation from my real life, but as part of a new real life that honored all aspects of who I was. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked. "Once you make this transition, there's no going back to invisible wealth." "I'm sure," I said, looking out at my mountain views, my gardens, my life. "I'm done hiding." That afternoon, Dorothy and I were sitting on the terrace when my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I felt my heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain altitude. "Hello, Marcus?" "Mom." His voice was different than it had been during our confrontation, softer but also more distant. "I've been thinking about everything, and I wanted to call before I heard about it through the neighborhood." "Heard about what?" "The for sale sign in your front yard." I smiled, impressed, despite everything, by how quickly news traveled in small communities. News travels fast. So it's true? You're selling the house? Yes, I said simply. I'm making some changes in my life. There was a long pause, and I could hear the weight of unasked questions in the silence. Where will you live? He asked finally. Here, I said, looking out at the mountains that were starting to feel like home. And at the other properties, I have options. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, I know I said I needed time to think, and I do. But I also wanted you to know that I love you. Even though I'm confused and hurt, I still love you. The words were exactly what I needed to hear, even if they came with qualifications that reminded me how much work we still had to do. I love you too, Marcus, I said. And when you're ready, I'd like to show you more of this place. I'd like to share this part of my life with you if you'll let me. Maybe, he said. Someday, when I figure out how to process all of this. After we hung up, I sat with Dorothy on my terrace, watching the sun set over my mountains, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The possibility of living authentically, of being seen completely, of claiming space in the world without apology. You know what this reminds me of? Dorothy said, gesturing toward the mountain vista spread out before us. What? Those fairy tales where the princess spends years disguised as a servant, and then one day she puts on her crown, and everyone remembers who she really was all along. I laughed, the sound echoing across the terrace and into the valley below. Except in this story, the princess bought her own crown and built her own castle. Even better, Dorothy said, raising her wine glass in a toast. Here's to queens who crown themselves. The wine was excellent, the view was spectacular, and for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of my mountain estate, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for a gathering that would have been unimaginable when this journey began. The granite countertops were covered with ingredients for a feast that honored both tradition and the reality of who I'd become. Fresh herbs from my own gardens, wine from my own cellar, and recipes that had been passed down through generations of Howard women, now being prepared in a kitchen that most people only see in magazines. Dorothy had arrived 3 days earlier, officially as my houseguest but functionally as my dearest friend and the sister I'd never had. She'd sold her small house 6 weeks after I'd sold mine, using the proceeds to buy a comfortable condo in the same North Carolina town where my estate was located. We'd become each other's chosen family, 2 women in their golden years who'd decided that life was too short to waste on anything that didn't bring joy. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny celebrations. I was humming while I worked, something I'd found myself doing more and more as the months passed. There was a lightness in my chest that had replaced the constant weight I'd carried for so many years. The burden of keeping secrets and managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own authenticity. Marcus had called the night before, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that had characterized our conversations since that dramatic day when he'd discovered the truth about my circumstances. He'd asked what he could bring to dinner, a question that represented months of slow progress towards some kind of understanding between us. Just bring yourself, I'd told him, the same answer I'd given every time he'd asked. That's all I've ever wanted. The truth was that our relationship was still fragile, still being rebuilt piece by careful piece. Marcus had needed time to grieve the version of his mother he'd thought he knew, and I'd had to learn patience with his process. We'd had several difficult conversations over the months, some ending in tears, others in frustrated silence, but we'd kept talking. That seemed like progress worth celebrating. Jennifer had chosen not to come, a decision that had hurt Marcus but hadn't surprised me. She'd never quite recovered from the revelation that her assumptions about our family's financial hierarchy had been completely wrong. In her mind, I'd committed the unforgivable sin of disrupting her carefully constructed narrative about success and status. I'd offered to fly her parents in from Oregon for the holiday, but she declined with a coolness that suggested the breach between us might be permanent. I'd made peace with that possibility. Not everyone was capable of adjusting their understanding when reality shifted, and I couldn't force Jennifer to accept the woman I'd revealed myself to be. What I could do was continue being that woman, openly and without apology, and let others decide how they wanted to relate to her. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted my morning preparations, and I looked out to see a familiar rental car pulling into the circular drive. Marcus emerged from the driver's seat, moving with the same careful precision he'd shown as a child when approaching something that made him nervous. But there was something different about him today, a looseness in his shoulders that suggested he was finally beginning to relax into this new version of our relationship. He was carrying a bottle of wine, something expensive judging by the way he held it, and wearing clothes that looked more casual than his usual careful businessman attire. Jeans and a sweater that brought out the color of his eyes, the same eyes that had looked at me with such hurt and confusion 6 months ago. I met him at the front door, noting that he no longer paused to stare at the mansion's grandeur the way he had during his first visit. The shock had worn off, replaced by something that might eventually become acceptance. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," he said, embracing me with warmth that felt genuine rather than obligatory. "Happy Thanksgiving, sweetheart," I replied, holding him perhaps a moment longer than necessary, grateful for every sign that we were finding our way back to each other. Dorothy appeared from the direction of the library, where she'd been reading by the fireplace with one of the estate's resident cats curled in her lap. She greeted Marcus with the easy affection of someone who'd watched him grow up, though their relationship had deepened considerably since she'd become a regular presence in my new life. "How's Jennifer doing?" Dorothy asked as we made our way toward the kitchen, the question gentle but direct in the way that only longtime friends could manage. "She's fine," Marcus said, though his tone suggested the subject was still complicated. "She's spending the holiday with her sister in Portland. She needed some time to process everything." What he didn't say, but what I understood, was that Jennifer was still struggling with the idea that her mother-in-law had resources and options that exceeded her own. The power dynamic she'd thought she understood had been completely inverted, and she hadn't yet figured out how to navigate a relationship where I was no longer the dependent elderly relative she'd once assumed me to be. We spent the morning cooking together, the three of us moving around the expansive kitchen with an ease that had developed over Marcus's previous visits. He'd been surprised, during his first stay after our confrontation, to discover that I was the same person in luxury surroundings that I'd been in modest ones. The same sense of humor, the same care for others, the same woman who'd raised him, just no longer constrained by artificial limitations. "I keep thinking about what you said," Marcus told me as he chopped vegetables for the stuffing, his movements precise and focused. "About wanting me to become the kind of man who succeeded on his own merit." I looked up from the turkey I was preparing, noting the thoughtful expression on his face. We'd had fragments of this conversation before, but never when he seemed ready to really explore it. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral to give him space to work through his thoughts. "I think I understand it better now," he said slowly. "When I was growing up, I always felt this pressure to take care of you eventually, to make sure you were secure and comfortable. It drove a lot of my ambition, knowing that your future depended on my success." Dorothy looked up from the pie crust she was rolling, clearly interested in this development but wise enough not to interrupt. "And now?" I prompted gently. "Now I realize that pressure shaped me in ways that were probably good for me," Marcus continued. "I worked harder, saved more, made more careful decisions, because I thought other people were counting on me. If I'd known you were already secure, would I have pushed myself the same way? I honestly don't know." The admission hung in the kitchen air, mixing with the sense of roasting turkey and the herbs I'd harvested from my own garden. It was the closest Marcus had come to acknowledging that my decision to keep my wealth secret might have had merit, even if the secrecy itself had caused pain. "But I also think," he added, setting down his knife and turning to face me directly, "that you robbed us both of something by keeping it secret for so long. You robbed me of the chance to know my mother completely, and you robbed yourself of the chance to be seen completely." The words were fair, and they carried the weight of months of reflection. I could see in his eyes that he wasn't trying to hurt me, but rather to articulate something he'd been struggling to understand about the price of the choices I'd made. "You're right," I said simply, "about all of it. The secrecy served a purpose, but it also created distance between us that didn't need to exist." "So what do we do now?" Marcus asked, the question carrying all the weight of our shared uncertainty about how to rebuild a relationship on a foundation of complete honesty. "We start from where we are," I said, echoing advice Margaret had given me months earlier. "We don't try to go back and change the past. We just decide who we want to be with each other going forward." Dorothy smiled from her position at the counter, clearly pleased with the direction of our conversation. She'd become something of a relationship counselor for both Marcus and me, offering perspective from her position as someone who loved us both, but hadn't been damaged by the years of secrecy. The afternoon passed in the kind of comfortable domesticity that I'd been missing for years. We prepared the grille meal together, sharing stories and memories, creating new traditions that honored both where we'd come from and where we were heading. Marcus told us about his work, about projects he was excited about and challenges he was facing, the conversation flowing with an ease that hadn't existed when he'd felt obligated to protect me from worry about his problems. When dinner was ready, we gathered around the dining table in the formal dining room, though I'd had the staff arrange it for intimacy rather than grandeur. Candles reflected in the crystal chandelier, flowers from my gardens created centerpieces that brought the outdoors inside, and the meal we'd prepared together filled the polished table with abundance. As we sat down to eat, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the path that had brought us to this moment. The pain of the revelation, the months of careful rebuilding, the slow process of learning to trust each other again with complete honesty, all of it had led to this dinner where we could simply be together without pretense or secrets. "I want to say something," Marcus said as we began passing dishes around the table. "I've been thinking a lot about this day, about what it represents, and I want to acknowledge something that I haven't said clearly enough." He paused, gathering his thoughts in the way he'd done since childhood, when he wanted to make sure his words carried the weight he intended. "Mom, I spent a lot of months being angry about this secrecy, about feeling like I'd been lied to. And some of that anger was justified. But I also need to acknowledge that the life you gave me, the man you helped me become, those things are real regardless of the financial circumstances that surrounded them." He looked directly at me across the candlelit table, his eyes holding the kind of sincerity that reminded me of the little boy he'd once been. "You worked double shifts to support us. You sacrificed your own comfort to make sure I had opportunities. You taught me about integrity and hard work and putting family first. None of that was fake, just because you had money in the bank that you chose not to spend." The words settled into my chest, like warm honey, healing wounds I'd been carrying since that first painful confrontation. For months, I'd wondered whether everything good about our relationship had been built on false pretenses, whether the love between us could survive the revelation of who I really was. "And I need to apologize," Marcus continued, "for the way Jennifer and I treated you before all this came out. The way we talked about age and what you were capable of. The way we made assumptions about what kind of vacation would be appropriate for you. That was wrong, and it was disrespectful, and it had nothing to do with money." Dorothy reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She'd heard enough stories about that painful exclusion from the Aspen trip to understand how much Marcus's acknowledgement meant. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means more to me than you know." "I also want you to know," Marcus said, "that I'm proud of you for finally living openly, for claiming this life and sharing it with people who matter to you. You look happier than I've seen you in years." He was right. I did feel happier, lighter, more authentically myself than I could remember being since Winston died, and left me with the burden of managing wealth in isolation. The decision to live openly, to share my circumstances with friends like Dorothy, to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world, had transformed not just my external circumstances but my internal landscape as well. We ate slowly, savoring both the food and the conversation, which ranged from memories of past holidays to plans for future ones. Marcus asked about my other properties, expressing genuine curiosity about the Vermont estate and the Colorado acreage that had been part of Winston's paranoid investment strategy. "I'd like to see them sometime," he said as we moved into dessert course. "If you'd be willing to share that part of your life with me." "I'd love that," I said, meaning it completely. "There's a lot I'd like to show you," A lot of stories about your grandfather that I never told because I thought I was protecting you from the complexity of his character. Tell me one now, Marcus said, settling back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone prepared to listen. I thought about which story would capture Winston's essential nature without overwhelming Marcus with too much information at once. Did I ever tell you about the time he bought an entire ghost town in Nevada? I asked, smiling at the memory. Marcus's eyes widened. A ghost town? Cerro Gordo, I said, naming a place that existed only in my memories and old property deeds. He read an article about how mining towns were being abandoned, and he drove out there with a suitcase full of cash and bought the whole thing from a man who just wanted to get rid of it. Dorothy leaned forward, clearly as fascinated as Marcus by this glimpse into Winston's unconventional investment philosophy. What did he do with a ghost town? Marcus asked. Nothing for years, I said, laughing at the absurdity of it. He just liked knowing he owned it. Said it made him feel like he had options if the government ever came after his bank accounts. But then, about 10 years later, a movie company wanted to film a Western there, and they paid him more for a 6-week rental than he'd paid for the entire town. That's incredible, Marcus said, shaking his head in amazement. How many properties like that are there? More than you might expect, I said, thinking about the thick folders of deeds and titles that Margaret maintained in her office. Your grandfather was convinced that land was the only investment that couldn't be manipulated by banks or governments, so he bought anything that seemed undervalued, regardless of location or condition. And you've been managing all of it this whole time? With Margaret's help, I confirmed. Some properties we've sold when the market was right. Others we've developed or improved. A few we've just held on to because Winston would have wanted us to. The conversation continued long into the evening, moving from the dining room to the great room where we built a fire and settled into the comfortable chairs with wine and the kind of easy companionship I'd been missing for years. Marcus asked questions about the business side of managing wealth, about the decisions I'd made and the challenges I'd faced, and I found myself sharing not just information, but perspective. The thing about money, I told him as we watched flames dance in the massive stone fireplace, is that it doesn't change who you are, but it reveals who you are. It gives you options, but it also gives you responsibility. And it can isolate you if you're not careful about how you handle it. Is that why you were so careful about sharing it? Marcus asked. Partly, I said, considering the question that had become central to our healing process. But mostly I was afraid that if people knew I had money, they would start seeing me differently. As a source rather than as a person. As someone to manage rather than someone to love. Dorothy, who had been quietly listening to our conversation, spoke up from her position in a chair near the fire. You know what I think? I think you were afraid that if people knew you were wealthy, they'd stop seeing you as strong. Because in your mind, needing money meant needing help. And needing help meant being weak. Her observation hit me with the force of truth I hadn't fully recognized until she articulated it. She was right. I had equated financial independence with personal strength. And I'd been afraid that revealing my wealth would somehow diminish the respect I'd earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. But that's not how strength works, Dorothy continued gently. Strength isn't about doing everything alone. It's about making choices that honor who you are and what you value. And you've been making strong choices all along, even when they were hard choices. Marcus was nodding, clearly processing this perspective on our family's complicated relationship with money and independence. I think I understand better now why the vacation thing hurt so much, he said slowly. It wasn't just that we excluded you, it was that we made assumptions about your limitations without bothering to ask what you might actually want or be capable of. Exactly, I said, grateful that he was beginning to see the deeper patterns that had shaped our interactions. You saw the modest house and the careful spending and assumed that was all there was to me, but I had been deliberately keeping myself small to make others comfortable. And when we basically told you that you were too old and too limited for our adventure, we were reinforcing exactly the kind of diminishment you'd been fighting against your whole life, Marcus said, understanding dawning in his voice. Yes, I said simply, and I realized that I was done making myself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. We sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts as the fire crackled and the night settled around the estate. Through the great room windows I could see stars appearing in the clear mountain sky, bright and infinite, in a way that reminded me of the possibilities that had opened up since I'd chosen to live authentically. "Mom," Marcus said eventually, his voice thoughtful in the way that suggested he was working up to something important. "I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you sacrificed for me, but I also want you to know that I don't need you to keep sacrificing. I want you to live the life you want to live. Travel to the places you want to see. Do the things that bring you joy." The words were exactly what I needed to hear, permission I'd been giving myself but hadn't quite believed I deserved. "I also want to ask you something," he continued, "and I want you to answer honestly, even if you think I might not like the answer." "Of course," I said, though I felt a flutter of nervousness about what he might want to know. "Do you think I would have turned out differently if I'd known about the money? Do you think I would have been less motivated, less responsible, less myself?" The question he'd been carrying for months, the fear that had underlain all our conversations about my decision to keep his inheritance secret. It was the question that went to the heart of everything, the fear that knowing about wealth would have fundamentally changed who he became. I considered my answer carefully, looking at the man sitting across from me, successful and thoughtful and kind despite the challenges life had thrown at him. "I think you would have been different," I said honestly. "But I don't think you would have been worse. You might have been more confident earlier, less worried about security, more willing to take creative risks. Those aren't necessarily bad things. But you chose to keep it secret anyway." "I chose to keep it secret because I was afraid," I admitted. "Not afraid that you'd become a bad person, but afraid that you'd stop needing me. Afraid that if you knew you were financially secure, you wouldn't need your mother anymore." The admission hung in the air between us, perhaps the most honest thing I'd said since this entire journey began. It wasn't really about teaching Marcus responsibility or building his character. It was about my own fear of becoming irrelevant in his life. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Mom, I didn't love you because I needed your financial support. I loved you because you were my mother, because you showed up for me, because you believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Money wouldn't have changed that." "I know that now," I said, feeling tears prick at my eyes. "But I didn't know it then. And by the time I realized my mistake, the secret had become so big that I didn't know how to share it without damaging everything we'd built together." Dorothy reached over and handed me a tissue, her own eyes damp with sympathy for the complicated emotions we were all navigating. "The important thing," she said quietly, "is that you're both here now, having this conversation, building something new based on truth instead of fear." She was right, of course. We couldn't change the past, but we could decide how to move forward. In sitting in my great room with my son and my dearest friend, surrounded by beauty I no longer felt obligated to hide, I felt hopeful about the future we were creating together. As the evening wound down and we prepared for bed, Marcus hugged me with a warmth that reminded me of the little boy he'd once been, before life became complicated by secrets and assumptions and the weight of unspoken truths. "I love you, Mom," he said, the words carrying none of the careful distance that had characterized our interactions for months. "All of you, the woman who worked double shifts, and the woman who owns mountain estates. You don't have to choose between them anymore." "I love you too," I said, holding him tight and feeling, for the first time in years, that he was really seeing me completely. The next morning, I woke up to find Marcus and Dorothy in the kitchen together, making coffee and talking quietly like old friends. There was something profoundly satisfying about seeing the people I loved most comfortable in my space. No longer guests, but family, in the truest sense. "We were talking about Christmas," Dorothy said as I joined them at the kitchen island. "Marcus was asking about your tradition of hosting, and I was telling him about how different things have been since you moved here." "Different how?" I asked, pouring myself coffee from the pot they'd prepared. "Better," Marcus said simply. "Dorothy was telling me about the people you've met in town, the friends you've made, the way you've gotten involved in the community. It sounds like you're actually living instead of just existing." He was right. In the months since I'd moved to the estate full-time, I'd discovered a version of myself that had been buried under years of careful modesty. I'd joined the local historical society, donated to causes that mattered to me, made friends who knew me as Thelma Howard, the estate owner, rather than Marcus's modest mother. I'd claimed space in the world that matched the scope of my actual circumstances. "I'd like to spend Christmas here too," Marcus said, the words carrying the weight of a decision that went far beyond holiday plans. "If that's okay with you." "It's more than okay," I said, feeling my heart expand with possibility. "It's exactly what I was hoping for." We spent Marcus's last day at the estate, walking through the gardens, exploring parts of the property he hadn't seen before, and making plans for his return visit. As he prepared to leave, I could see that something fundamental had shifted between us. We were no longer trying to rebuild the relationship we'd had before. We were creating something entirely new, based on complete honesty and mutual respect. Standing in my circular drive as he loaded his suitcase into the rental car, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this point. The pain of the revelation, the months of careful healing, the slow process of learning to trust each other with complete truth, all of it had been necessary to reach this moment of genuine connection. "Drive safely," I said, embracing him one last time. "I will," he promised. "And Mom, thank you." "For what?" "For finally letting me know all of you," he said, getting into the car. "For being brave enough to live authentically, even when it was scary." As I watched him drive away, winding down the mountain road toward whatever his future held, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with endings and everything to do with new beginnings. I was no longer the woman who made herself small to make others comfortable. I was no longer hiding parts of myself to maintain relationships built on incomplete truths. I was Thelma Howard, wealthy woman, estate owner, mother, friend, and person in my own right. I was someone who deserved beautiful things and wasn't afraid to claim them. I was someone who took up space in the world without apology, and invited others to do the same. Dorothy joined me in the circular drive, slipping her arm through mine as we watched the taillights of Marcus's car disappear around the bend. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like coming home," I said, looking up at the mansion that no longer felt like a secret but like the authentic expression of a life lived on my own terms. "Good," Dorothy said, squeezing my arm. "Because this is just the beginning." She was right. This was just the beginning of a life lived without secrets, without shame, without the constant weight of managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own joy. It was the beginning of relationships built on complete truth rather than careful omissions. It was the beginning of taking up all the space I deserved in my own life. And it felt magnificent. 3 years after that transformative Thanksgiving, I found myself preparing for an event I never could have imagined during my years of quiet living. The estate was being prepared for Marcus and Sarah's wedding, a celebration that would take place on the very terrace where I'd first reclaimed my authentic self with Caroline's photographs. Sarah Martinez had entered our lives 18 months after Marcus's divorce from Jennifer was finalized, appearing at a charity gala I'd hosted for the local children's hospital. She was a pediatric surgeon with warm brown eyes and an easy laugh, someone who saw Marcus for who he truly was, rather than what he could provide. More importantly, she'd met me as the wealthy estate owner I'd always been, rather than the modest retired nurse I'd pretended to be. The morning sun streamed through the great room windows as I reviewed the final details with Elena, the wedding planner I'd hired from Atlanta. Tables were being arranged on the main terrace, draped in ivory linens that would catch the golden hour light perfectly. The mountain vista would serve as a natural cathedral, and I'd commissioned a local artisan to create an arch from mountain laurel and wild roses that would frame the ceremony. "Mrs. Howard," Elena said, consulting her tablet with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing elaborate celebrations, "the caterers will arrive at noon to begin prep, and the string quartet is scheduled for a rehearsal at 2. Is there anything else you'd like to adjust?" I looked out at the terrace where my son would marry a woman who brought out the best in him, and felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the luxury surrounding us, and everything to do with the authenticity of the moment. "It's perfect," I said, meaning every word. Dorothy appeared from the direction of the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a dress that cost more than she used to spend on clothes in a year. She'd embraced the financial freedom that came with being my closest friend and housemate, allowing me to share not just my wealth but the joy of using it meaningfully. The bride's family just arrived, she announced, settling into one of the leather chairs with the familiarity of someone who belonged there completely. Sarah's mother is absolutely beside herself with excitement about the venue. Dr. Carmen Martinez had been gracious from the moment I'd met her, treating me with the respect due to Marcus's mother rather than making assumptions based on age or appearance. She was a retired high school principal from El Paso, a woman who understood strength and dignity in all their forms. Her husband Miguel was a contractor who'd built half the affordable housing in their hometown, and their easy acceptance of our family's circumstances had been a gift I hadn't expected. "How is Marcus handling the preparations?" I asked, knowing my son's tendency toward perfectionism could make him anxious during important events. "He's actually remarkably calm," Dorothy said, sipping her coffee with obvious pleasure. "I think having Sarah's steadying influence has changed him. He seems more settled in his own skin than I've ever seen him." She was right. The man who'd struggled so painfully with the revelation of my hidden wealth had evolved into someone comfortable with complexity. Someone who could hold multiple truths simultaneously without feeling threatened by contradiction. His relationship with Sarah had been built on complete honesty from the beginning, and that foundation had given him confidence in ways that extended far beyond romance. The sound of laughter drifted from the direction of the guest wing, where Sarah and her bridesmaids were preparing for the afternoon ceremony. I'd insisted that she and her family stay at the estate for the entire wedding weekend, wanting them to experience the full hospitality that came with having access to such space and resources. "I should check on the bride," I said, standing and smoothing my own outfit. A silk dress in deep blue that brought out my eyes and made me feel elegant rather than merely appropriate. I found Sarah in the master suite I'd prepared for her, surrounded by her sister and closest friends, but remarkably composed for someone about to walk down an aisle that had been photographed for magazines. She was sitting by the windows that overlooked the gardens, her wedding dress spread around her like flower petals, her dark hair styled in a way that was both sophisticated and natural. "Thelma," she said, rising to embrace me with the warmth that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. "Thank you again for making this possible. This place is like something from a fairy tale." "Thank you for making my son so happy," I replied, meaning it completely. I haven't seen him this content since he was a little boy. The truth was that Sarah had given Marcus something I'd never been able to provide. A relationship built entirely on truth from the very beginning. She'd known about the family wealth, the complicated history, the years of secrets and revelations, and she'd chosen to love him anyway. More than that, she'd helped him understand that his worth wasn't diminished by his mother's circumstances, whatever they might be. As I helped her with the final details of her preparations, I reflected on how much had changed since that painful dinner conversation 3 years ago, when Marcus had excluded me from his Aspen vacation. The man who'd once seen me as too old for adventure was now celebrating his marriage at my mountain estate, surrounded by friends and family who knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of providing. The ceremony itself was everything I could have hoped for. Marcus stood beneath the mountain laurel arch looking handsome and confident, no longer the conflicted man who'd struggled with his mother's hidden complexity. When Sarah appeared at the far end of the terrace, walking between the carefully arranged tables toward the man she'd chosen to build a life with, I felt tears of pure joy streaming down my face. Dorothy reached over and squeezed my hand as we watched the exchange of vows, promises that rang with sincerity across the mountain air. The string quartet played selections that honored both traditional wedding music and pieces that held special meaning for the couple, creating a soundtrack that felt both timeless and deeply personal. "You may kiss your bride," the officiant announced, and the terrace erupted in applause that echoed across the valley below. During the reception that followed, I found myself moving easily among guests who represented every aspect of my complex life. Former colleagues from the hospital mingled with neighbors from my old modest subdivision, new friends from the North Carolina community mixed with Sarah's family from Texas, and everyone seemed comfortable in the kind of luxury that had once felt impossible to share. "This is incredible," said Helen from my old book club, approaching me with a glass of champagne and eyes wide with continuing amazement at my transformed circumstances. "I still can't quite believe this is your life now. It's always been my life," I said gently, no longer defensive about the choices I'd made but simply factual about the reality I'd finally chosen to embrace. I just wasn't ready to share it until recently. The evening continued with dancing on the terrace as the sun set behind the mountains, painting everything in golden light that made every photograph look like a professional portrait. Marcus and Sarah moved together with the easy grace of people who'd found their perfect match, and I felt a deep satisfaction watching them begin their married life in a place that represented authenticity and abundance rather than limitation and pretense. As the night wound down and guests began retiring to their rooms throughout the estate, I found myself alone on a quiet corner of the terrace, with Dr. Martinez, Sarah's mother. We'd developed a friendship over the months of wedding planning, two mothers who'd raised successful children through different challenges but with similar dedication. "Thank you for this," Carmen said, gesturing toward the celebration that was still continuing around us. "Not just for the beautiful venue, but for raising the kind of man who could love my daughter the way she deserves." "Thank you for raising the kind of woman who could see past our family's complications to love Marcus for who he really is," I replied. We stood in comfortable silence, watching our children dance beneath stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. It occurred to me that this moment represented everything I'd hoped for when I'd first made the decision to live authentically. Not just the luxury or the beautiful setting, but the relationships built on complete truth, the celebrations that honored who we really were rather than who we thought we should be. The months following the wedding brought new adventures that I embraced with the confidence of someone who'd finally learned to claim space in the world without apology. I traveled to the Vermont estate for the first time in decades, discovering that Winston's worthless forest land had become a pristine retreat surrounded by some of the most expensive real estate in New England. Dorothy and I spent a month there during fall foliage season, hiking trails that wound through forests ablaze with color, entertaining friends in a lodge that rivaled anything in luxury travel magazines, and hosting Sarah and Marcus for their first anniversary celebration. The young couple had embraced the full scope of what family wealth could provide, using their honeymoon fund for a medical mission to Guatemala instead, knowing that their travel dreams would always be supported by resources that extended far beyond their own salaries. "I love that they're not taking it for granted," Dorothy observed as we watched Marcus and Sarah explore the Vermont property with the enthusiasm of people discovering new possibilities. "They understand that wealth is a tool for creating experiences and helping others, not just for accumulating possessions." She was right. Both Marcus and Sarah had approached the family resources with thoughtfulness and purpose, supporting causes they cared about while building careers that mattered to them regardless of financial necessity. Sarah had established a free clinic in her hometown, while Marcus had left his corporate consulting job to work with nonprofit organizations, focusing on sustainable development projects in underserved communities. The transformation in Marcus's relationship with money and purpose had been remarkable to witness. Freed from the anxiety about financial security that had driven many of his earlier decisions, he'd become someone willing to take meaningful risks, to prioritize impact over income, to use his skills in service of causes that aligned with his values. "It's funny," he told me during a quiet conversation on the Vermont Lodge's wraparound porch. "I spent so many years worried about making enough money to take care of you eventually. Now that I know you're more than capable of taking care of yourself, I can focus on work that actually matters to me." "That's exactly what I hoped would happen," I said, though I hadn't been wise enough to articulate that hope during the years when I'd kept my circumstances secret. Not the financial freedom specifically, but the freedom to choose work based on passion rather than fear. The conversation reminded me of something Margaret had said years earlier about wealth providing options rather than obligations. Marcus was finally experiencing what it meant to have genuine choice about how to spend his time and energy, unencumbered by worries about basic security or the need to maintain a certain lifestyle to prove his worth. As autumn deepened into winter at the Vermont estate, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called the local realtor and inquired about purchasing additional property in the area, land that could be developed into a retreat center for medical professionals, like Sarah, who needed respite from the intensity of their work. "Are you sure about this?" Dorothy asked when I shared my plans. "It's a significant undertaking, and you've already got plenty of projects keeping you busy." "I'm sure," I said, looking out at the forest that had been part of Winston's paranoid investment strategy, and seeing instead a place where healing could happen for people who dedicated their lives to healing others. "I've spent 3 years learning to live authentically. Now I want to spend whatever time I have left using my resources to create opportunities for other people to do the same. The retreat center project became my new passion, requiring me to work with architects and contractors, environmental specialists, and hospitality experts, all while ensuring that the development honored both the natural beauty of the land and the needs of the people who would use it. It was challenging work that demanded skills I'd never thought I possessed, but I discovered that the same determination that had gotten me through nursing school and single motherhood served me well in managing complex projects. Marcus and Sarah became enthusiastic partners in the venture, contributing their professional expertise to ensure that the retreat would serve medical professionals effectively. Sarah's understanding of the burnout and stress common in healthcare settings helped shape programs that would address both physical and emotional exhaustion, while Marcus's organizational skills proved invaluable in managing the many moving parts of the development process. By the following summer, ground had been broken on a cluster of buildings that would blend seamlessly into the forest setting while providing accommodations and meeting spaces for groups of healthcare workers seeking renewal and perspective. The design honored both luxury and sustainability, creating spaces that felt restorative rather than simply expensive. "This is going to change lives," Sarah said as we toured the construction site, envisioning the finished retreat that would welcome its first guests the following year. "The doctors and nurses who come here won't just be resting. They'll be remembering why they chose medicine in the first place." The retreat center represented something I'd never thought I wanted, a legacy project that would extend my impact far beyond my own lifetime. Working on it had given me a sense of purpose that transcended the personal satisfaction of living authentically. I was creating something that would serve others long after I was gone, using resources that had been hidden for too long to build something meaningful and lasting. As the project neared completion, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from that painful dinner conversation with Marcus to this moment of purposeful creation. The woman who'd been told she was too old for adventure had become someone building retreats for other people's adventures in healing and renewal. The irony wasn't lost on me that wealth, which I'd hidden for fear it would damage my relationships, had ultimately become the foundation for deeper connections with family and friends, and for contributions to communities I'd never imagined being able to serve. The resources that had once felt like a burden of secrecy had transformed into tools for creating beauty, supporting important work, and building bridges between people and possibilities. Standing in the main lodge of the retreat center during its final construction phase, surrounded by windows that framed views of the forest Winston had purchased decades ago for reasons he could never have articulated, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending of something, but the fulfillment of potential that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to emerge. Dorothy joined me in the lodge's great room, her presence a reminder of how much my understanding of family had expanded to include the people who chose to share my life, rather than only those connected by blood. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling into one of the chairs we'd chosen for their comfort and their view of the surrounding forest. "I'm thinking about second acts," I said, watching workers put finishing touches on features that would soon welcome exhausted medical professionals seeking restoration. How sometimes the most important part of your life doesn't begin until you're brave enough to stop hiding who you really are. The retreat center opened the following spring with a weekend program for emergency room physicians from across New England. Watching them arrive, seeing the tension in their shoulders begin to ease as they experienced the environment we'd created, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything wealth had provided when it was simply accumulated rather than shared. The success of that first program led to a waiting list for future retreats and inquiries about establishing similar centers in other locations. Medical professionals hungry for renewal had found something they didn't even know they were missing, a place where their dedication to healing was honored through an environment designed specifically for their restoration. "You've started something important," Marcus told me as we watched the first group of retreaters participate in a closing ceremony that marked the end of their renewal experience. "This is going to grow into something much bigger than any of us imagined." He was right. Within 2 years, the Vermont retreat had inspired similar centers in Colorado and North Carolina, each one designed to serve healthcare workers, while honoring the unique characteristics of its location. What had begun as a single project had evolved into a movement, creating healing spaces for people whose work demanded everything they had to give. The retreat network became my primary focus during the remaining years of my 70s, though I also continued to enjoy the personal luxuries that had been denied for so long. I traveled extensively, often with Dorothy, exploring places Winston's investments had made accessible, while also scouting locations for potential future retreat sites. Each journey reinforced my understanding that wealth's true value lay not in the comfort it provided, but in the choices it made possible. Whether I was dining at exclusive restaurants in European capitals or hiking remote trails in national parks, the real luxury was the freedom to choose experiences based on curiosity and desire, rather than limitation and fear. The estate in North Carolina remained my primary residence, but it had evolved from a secret refuge into a gathering place where friends and family came together regularly. Holiday celebrations became annual traditions that drew people from across the country, creating new memories in spaces that had once held only the weight of hidden potential. Marcus and Sarah's marriage flourished in an environment where family relationships were built on complete honesty, rather than careful omissions. They bought a house near the estate, close enough for regular dinners and collaboration on retreat center projects, far enough away to maintain their independence and privacy. The birth of their first child, a daughter they named Elena after the wedding planner, who'd become a family friend, brought new joy to relationships that had been rebuilt on stronger foundations than their original iterations. Watching Marcus become a father, seeing how naturally he balanced love and limits without the burden of secrets that had complicated his own childhood, I felt deep satisfaction with the path that had led us to this place of authentic connection. "She's going to know her grandmother completely," Sarah said as we sat on the estate's terrace, baby Elena sleeping peacefully in her arms while mountains stretched endlessly beyond us. No secrets, no pretending to be less than you are. Just the full truth of who you've always been. The prospect of being known completely by a grandchild, who would grow up understanding that family could encompass both struggle and abundance, both modesty and luxury, both careful choices and generous sharing, felt like the ultimate validation of the courage it had taken to live authentically. As I moved into my 80s, still healthy and energetic enough to manage multiple properties and expanding retreat programs, I often reflected on the conversation that had started this transformation. Marcus telling me I was too old for his ski vacation had been devastating in the moment, but it had also been the catalyst for discovering what it meant to live without apology. The woman who'd been excluded from adventure had created adventures for others. The mother who'd been seen as limited by age and circumstances had built a legacy that would serve people for generations. The person who'd hidden her capabilities had become someone whose name was associated with innovation and generosity in communities across multiple states. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that authenticity wasn't a destination, but a practice, a daily choice to show up as myself, rather than as the person others expected me to be. Whether I was hosting medical professionals at retreat centers or sharing quiet dinners with family at the estate, the common thread was my commitment to being fully present, as the complex, capable, generous woman I'd always been, underneath the careful modesty that had once defined my public presence. The mountain views from my terrace remained spectacular, but they no longer represented escape from a life lived too small. They represented the endless possibilities that opened up when someone finally claimed all the space they deserved in their own story, when they stopped apologizing for taking up room in the world, when they chose abundance over artificial limitation. Standing on that terrace as the sun set behind peaks that had witnessed my transformation from hidden wealth to purposeful legacy, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived fully. Not perfect, not without painful lessons and difficult conversations, but authentic in ways that honored both who I'd been and who I'd become. The woman who'd once eaten scraps while others enjoyed the feast had learned to set her own table, invite her own guests, and create celebrations that honored everyone's capacity for growth and change. And that, more than any amount of money or any number of properties, felt like true wealth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.